Good day and welcome to lesson 3 in our study of the book of Mark. Today we're going to continue on in chapter 1 and do a few more verses as we go through this rather slowly. Last time we mentioned how Mark was a very sparse man as far as words were concerned. He was right direct and to the point, and he started his book off with a very simple yet profound statement that this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. This was literally the way he started this off. And then he introduced how the prophets had foretold this and how John came baptizing in the wilderness. Now, John and Jesus were actually relatives because John's mother Elizabeth was a relative of Jesus' mother Mary. So they undoubtedly knew each other growing up and knew some of the specialities that Jesus probably had. So this was probably not an unusual thing to see John preparing the way for Christ. Now John was what you might call a first century hippie in the way he dressed. He says he was clothed with camel's hair and with a leather belt around his waist, and he ate locusts and wild honey. I mean, this was not the typical person of that era. He was a different man, but yet he was still used by God in a way that many others were not. He was baptizing people for remission of sins, and he was preparing the way for Christ. And as I said, this was not unusual for John and Jesus to be together because they were in fact relatives. But the way John dressed was reminiscent of the old prophet Elijah. If you go back to 2 Kings chapter 1 verse 8, it says Elijah was a hairy man wearing a leather belt. So there was some sort of semblance. So the people of the Jewish nation would have sort of some recollection of how this man represented one of the earlier prophets of the Bible. Anyway, it says that he was one of a particular group, a particular person. He was clothed with camel's hair, he had a leather belt around his waist, he ate locusts, wild honey, and he preached. And he preached saying, "There comes one after me who is mightier than I, whose sandal strap I am not worthy to stoop down and loose." Now this is a sort of a funny statement in a sense, but if you go back to that time and place, loosening one's sandal strap was something that was not done lightly. And the Babylonian Talmud said that all services which a slave does for his master, a pupil should do for his teacher. All services that a slave did for his master, a pupil should do for his teacher, with the exception of undoing his shoes. This is from the Babylonian Talmud. In the day, the rabbis taught that a teacher might require just about anything of his students except to make them take off their sandals. This was considered too much. And John said he was not even worthy to do this. He said, "Whose sandal strap I am not worthy to stoop down and loose. I indeed baptized you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit." There's a difference in the baptisms, because John recognized that water itself did absolutely nothing. It was the baptism of the Holy Spirit which really counted. Then he says, "It came to pass in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan." Now there were four things here that are interesting, because if you look at the humbleness of this entire section, Jesus was not an uncommon name. Jesus was a very common name in those days. So it wasn't an uncommon, or it wasn't an unusual situation. Jesus was a common name. He came from Nazareth of Galilee, and Nazareth was not a very remarkable village. It was in fact despised. In fact, it said elsewhere in the Bible, what good can come from Nazareth? What good thing can come from Nazareth? So this was a common name person, coming from a despised or a small village of ill repute. He was baptized. Baptism was considered to be a process by which sinful people were reclaimed. So it was associated with sin, and he was baptized in the Jordan River. The Jordan River, I've been there myself, and it's not a very pleasant place to be as far as seeing. It's not, the water is murky, it's brownish, it's not clean. And in fact, even in those days, the early rabbinic tradition explicitly disqualified the River Jordan for purification because it was so dirty and polluted. So you have this very humble beginning. You have this humbleness, a humble name, a poor village, procedure that was done for sinners, and in a river which was really impure and disqualified for any kind of purification. You have this humbleness. And then it's followed by this sudden change. Immediately coming up from the water, he saw the heavens parting and the Spirit descending upon him like a dove. Then a voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." From the humbleness of the first part of this to now the glory of the second part. The heavens are parting. You can just picture the heavens opening up. A voice of God himself coming from the heavens. A blessing upon his Son. "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And the Holy Spirit coming down like a dove upon him. Now, why a dove? Because a dove is considered to be a very humble, a very quiet, a very unassuming type of creature. It never seems to be causing ruckuses or troubles. So it's sort of a gentle type of symbolism of the Holy Spirit. But you have the humbleness of the first part of this. It came to pass that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee, baptized in the Jordan. A common name, a small impoverished village, procedure for sinners, in a river that's polluted. And yet it goes to the second part. Afterwards, he saw the heavens parting, the Spirit descending like a dove, the voice of God himself saying, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And the dove coming down in a bodily form. This is the beginning of John's Gospel. Now it's interesting, if you look at the Roman Catholic, the New Jerusalem Bible, this is not what God apparently says in that Bible. It says, "You are my beloved Son, whom today I have fathered." Very similar to the phrase in the psalm, in the first few psalms. This, "You are my beloved, to whom today I have fathered." Not in whom I am well pleased, but to whom today I have fathered, indicating that when the Holy Spirit came upon him, that's when he recognized him as his Son. Now, I'm not too sure which one is correct. We have to go with what we have in our book, and this says, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." So you have this humbleness of the initial part of the baptism, and the glory of the second part of baptism. It's also, you should also understand that John was not someone who was recognized as a minister by the so-called main sort of religious people. There were no priests, there were no Pharisees, there were no Sadducees there. John was just someone who was appointed by God, and he was in a very different form. He wasn't dressed like an ordained person would be. He wasn't dressed like someone you'd expect to be doing a ceremony like this. He was dressed in camel's hair and a leather belt, but he was doing this. It wasn't the hierarchy of the church, of the Jewish temple that was doing this. This was something completely different from what was considered to be normal in those days. So God uses people who are not in the norm to do things which are extraordinary. And he also gives people who are common, coming from common places, the ability to have glorified endings. So this is the beginning of the story of Mark, or the Gospel of Mark, where he is baptizing Jesus. He obviously knew Jesus beforehand because they were relatives. So he knew probably what Jesus was going to do, what Jesus was up to and capable of. So he recognized that he was doing something in preparing the way for somebody coming greater than him. When he says, there is someone coming after me who is mightier than I, whose sandal strap I'm not worthy to stoop down and loose. He was going to baptize you with water, but he knew Christ would baptize him with the Holy Spirit. And this is how it unfolded. A voice came, pardon me, a voice came from heaven, you are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. But things don't stay at this high note. They change. And we're going to get onto that next week as we get into the temptations of Christ and what happens after this. So that is all for today. This is the baptism of Christ and the circumstances around it. But we'll get on to the next part of this next week as we go into start in verse 12. I hope to see you then. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.